Welcome everybody. Good morning. As Jordan said last time, we had some great discussions about standards as well and such. So it's really nice to be here today. And of course, I looked at the lineup of the conference, and as Jordan already mentioned, such great speakers. And I'm gonna say it straight out. They probably know more about the power grid than me, because my background is originally telecoms. So I think today I want to take you back a little bit in time for a few maybe past lessons, and then also showcase a few of the things that I see going on that are really valuable, I believe, to learn from, right? So that being said, I don't know, how many of you have ever used a machine like this. I mean, for the younger audience, it's a fax machine, and the interesting lesson here, I think, is that technology really moves very fast. So, of course, it ages me a little bit, but when I started working for Deutsche Telekom, the fax machine was really the killer application, believe it or not. It was the first time that we were able to actually send either an image or a signature page as such via a telephone line. So it was a big deal at the time. So this was in the mid 80s, 85, 86, 87, right? So you can see this is, it feels like it's a long time ago, and if you think about the years, oh yeah, it's already almost 40 years, of course. But nonetheless, if you look at the technology progress, it went really, really fast from there, right? So if you again compare what we had then, so we had the fax machine, we had telephones, and to be honest, I worked for a while in customer service at Deutsche Telekom in Germany, and it was very focused on one customer gets one line, gets one telephone, and done. It was even frowned upon sometimes when a customer said, "Oh, I wanted a second telephone in a different room." Customer service would literally talk them out of it to some extent, just because that's not what was done really, right? But then things progressed so quickly when we saw the internet popping up, right? In 1989 in Germany, you were already able to do some type of internet with obviously a dial-up, and then systems that were called Bildschirm text, basically screen text, where you could very rudimentary page access, where you could do that and manage your banking, for instance, and things like that. And then just things progressed a lot faster. And since we were also talking a bit about regulations here at this conference, it's maybe interesting to keep in mind that there was a big deregulation in the end of the 1990s into 2000 in the European Union. So the European Commission, for instance, decided that any type of quality control for these customer end devices would be pushed over to the industry. So with other words, all the quality requirements, and believe it or not, I don't know if you were in the industry at some point, but believe it or not, a headset like this that you see on the screen used to be tested for acoustical parameters. So it took a long time for these devices to get approved and passed, so fax standards, telecom standards, acoustical standards, and so on. And after the deregulation, it was much easier. You would test electromagnetic compatibility and whether you harm the network. With other words, it would only be checked that your device does not really interrupt the service for others. So I'm not saying that this is exactly what we need for the power grid. And in fact, it's a little different there. But I just want to give you that that starting image here, and to remember that things can change fairly quickly once the ball starts rolling here. So of course, then after the 2000 mark, we saw a lot of these industry alliances pop up, right? Wi-Fi alliance. Wi-Fi was at the right place at the right time. People were starting to use laptops in the late 1990s more, and then obviously the mobile phone popped up, with which pretty much changed the market very, very rapidly. So again, just keeping these things in mind, right? There was a good mix of strict regulations on frequency and other systems, combined with a fairly open market for consumer-facing products here. So again, just a little bit of a background here that can be to some extent translated to the utility or the power utility industry here. So now let's kind of switch to that a little bit. So I searched the web a little bit, ask a few AI systems. So what the European peak demand might become, and so there is different answers, of course, but we definitely see that there will be a large amount of extra energy needed in the European Union or the European area in general, with EVs, heat pumps, other new systems, and not even talking about things like data centers. That's a complete different story here. But we'll see that increase for sure. And as we have experienced now quite a bit, both in Europe and in the US and other places, that the weather changes will not make this much easier. Not saying it was weather related, but you probably heard about, or most likely heard about, the power outage recently in Portugal and Spain. I'm actually located in Portugal, so it was an interesting experience when the power was all of a sudden out on the entire area here. And it was actually rectified fairly quickly, since in Portugal, for instance, everything was going okay. Only the interconnect to Spain caused the drop here. So it took about 8 hours to bring the full power grid back up and running. I was lucky. I have a medium-sized battery at my house. The sun was out the whole day, so I was able to run. So obviously something to keep in mind here. But where can we really start making an impact, right? We need smarter infrastructure, that's for sure. We know that it's already going on since many years, and we are getting there. And I think we do want to keep regulations somewhat flexible. Of course, there needs to be a requirement for standards, for instance, and such. But I personally feel that in particular equipment and resources that are owned by the customer, need to belong to said customer. It's really tricky to find that balance between a utility mechanism to regulate or to control customer-owned equipment, and really kind of keeping everything in balance as far as the customer engagement and commitment is concerned. So flexibility on the customer side is important, but it needs to have a value for the customer. So maybe a quick look at a few things that you might actually know, obviously, maybe even better than me per se, but we from the OpenADR Alliance have been working with a number of entities in the UK since a while. So of course, the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero has been working on the so-called PAS 1878 and 79 standards for energy smart appliances since several years. If you haven't looked at that, I encourage you to look at that set of standards and that framework. There was recently a a comment from on the program with further dates and timelines moving forward. So it's definitely an interesting read. You can certainly find that online very easily from the department there. And it really looks at the end-to-end regulations for energy smart appliances. So the communication in the what's called interface A, from a distribution utility to a customer endpoint. One could say maybe a gateway or such, then named a consumer energy manager, the CEM, as kind of a new concept there. And for instance, in that interface, we were looking at OpenADR. So we helped on that. Going forward, potentially OpenADR 3 as well, which is our new version of the standard. And so, looking at everything, cybersecurity, stability, interoperability, and such, is really the key of this effort that targets, of course, heat pumps, water heaters, EV chargers, and things like that. And it's going to get real pretty soon, in a couple of years' time. So it's really a nice thing to see that progress there. Then something maybe not so many of you have heard of, but I encourage you also to look at that, is the Energy Networks Association in the UK. Has started the work on a flex market mechanism. And really the idea is also that we standardize the interactions between the DSOs and any type of energy aggregation. So that means, for instance, not only necessarily an aggregator company as such, but also really like for instance, a big farm, right? A farm that has, a bigger consumers, but also much solar and things like that. So there will be some interesting stuff coming out also later this year on that. So that being said, just a quick look here at some of the neighbors. Again, I would encourage you to kind of look that up and see what you find of interest here. But the Netherlands has been really struggling with congestion over the last few years, to the extent, and I didn't even know that until I talked to some of the folks there last year, to the extent that even residential building projects were quite literally stopped in their tracks because it became clear that there was not enough power available to these areas. And so they started now on a number of different fronts. So they built big what we would call maybe VPPs, for instance, in the Amsterdam harbor area. They encourage a big self-efficient VPPs, for instance, the Ajax Stadium in Amsterdam with solar battery support and such. And most recently, the utility companies there have started working with charge point operators, with the CPOs, to make the grid-aware charging a reality. So hopefully by the end of the summer, actually, there should also be a good profile spec for that out there. So again, something to look at for sure. In Sweden, the E.ON subsidiary there started a while ago already exploring flexibility with customers, the switch marketplace, and has recently then added also, for instance, standards support into that. So the rollout there is going on in smaller scales, but we hope that you can find some useful information there. And the last thing I wanted to mention, there's of course many other things going on, but the last thing I wanted to mention is an organization called Smart Energy Europe, or Smarten. They do a lot of policy intelligence and create reports that basically show requirements in order to, they are there to lobby regulators, the European Union, European Commission, and others. So their roadmap really calls for standardized data formats, dynamic tariffs, portability, all these same ideas that the department in the UK, as well as the Energy Networks Association, also is looking at. So that being said, now, before maybe looking at something that is already working since a long time, let's maybe do a bit of a time warp here, if you want. And that's also, I didn't do more of an introduction of myself, because I knew I would talk a little bit about the past here in the middle of the presentation. But if we go back to where in the United States real automated demand response, in a sense flexibility, started, for that we have to go back over 20 years. In fact, there was an energy crisis of some sort in California just after I moved there from Germany. So all of a sudden, I was still working in telecom, so it was a surprise to me. I knew nothing about utility or power utility stuff. And it was a surprise to me that all of a sudden we got news messages that there would be rolling blackouts in our city. So I was working along in my office. I was working for a testing and certification organization when, as planned, the power went out at, say, 2 o'clock in the afternoon for an hour. Essentially, the whole office was sitting there twiddling thumbs. Maybe some people with laptops were able to work a little bit, but not much more was being done. So that was really the starting point where the California Energy Commission decided, okay, we need a standardized way to communicate with customer equipment, but in a not so intrusive fashion. So there were a few key principles there that are true to this day. So they said the customer equipment is owned by the customer. We don't, want the utility to exert direct control there, unless it's maybe really an emergency, if we have to do something. Instead, we want to send informational and motivational messages to the customer. So that happened then in a way that, you would give, for instance, just requests for different sheds. At that point, it was straight peak load management, right? So you would just manage the peak that was happening during afternoon hours. This was, times where we didn't have that much rooftop solar and things like that. The so-called duck curve that many of you may have heard about was not so pronounced. So it was really early afternoon where they saw large peaks from air conditioning and other things that required a certain level of curtailment to flatten those peaks. So, fast forward a few years, the California Energy Commission was working through a grant with a number of utilities and firms to create the first version actually of OpenADR. And at the same time, the Zigbee Alliance created the Smart Energy Profile 1, which was a control and command spec, which later turned into Smart Energy Profile 2, which today is IEEE 2030.5, very good for networking devices together, directly controlling devices and things like that. But we had the Smart Energy Profile 1 in about 2005, and at first the utilities that were involved were really excited about that, because everybody thought, oh, now we can go through the smart meter, and with that Smart Energy Profile protocol and Zigbee devices, we can control all these appliances in the house, from a pool pump to a refrigerator and things like that. It took them about a year, I would say, until they realized, wait a second, controlling all these customer devices may not be such a great idea, right? What happens if something doesn't work, if the refrigerator doesn't work, and things like that, maybe the customer will call us, right? Who's going to field all these service calls? Because we have no way of really determining whether the fault is with us through the controls, or is it just a broken fridge, for instance. So tricky subjects there. So over the next 5 to 10 years, as both the local control systems evolved as well as OpenADR evolved, it became pretty clear that the philosophy of just informing and motivating the customer, was helpful in that sense, because you could keep, the customer in a sense at arm's length, while still being able to somewhat manage the systems. And of course, lately now it's way more complicated programs. So I have a few listed here, for instance. So already number of years, Southern California Edison, SCE, runs the so-called Charge Ready program. It's a public charging mechanism, where essentially Southern California Edison makes it a requirement that any public charger, or also charging network, of course, that is set up in their territory needs to be able to receive grid management messages. So with other words, they're typically capacity up and down regulation type messages, in this case over OpenADR. So for them, it was actually fairly straightforward to put this program together and to say, anybody that wants to build this, it's very simple. Add that interface towards our server, so we can tell your network to up or down regulate the power you consume. So there's the important idea here, right? We're not telling to one EV charger to be changed, right? We are telling the network, the charge point operator, to change the load in a certain area using their chargers. So then the CPO can manage, okay, which charger should do what. So that's totally a customer service. Then that program is running. Then we have a number of them. Pacific Gas and Electric was probably one of the first ones, even in 2005, running automated demand response programs. And lately now they are essentially also experimenting with dynamic pricing, things like that. For instance, also dynamic pricing over OpenADR 3 to a Matter gateway in the building. So again, very kind of customer centric to manage the whole building and the envelope of the consumption and also export of the building. And just across the United States, Con Edison in New York is running dynamic load management, also to essentially enable a storage developer and stacks for transmission and distribution value streams there. So bunch of good stuff going on. And lastly here, Ford and other car makers also hopped on the bandwagon, if you will, by providing a service to both customers as well as the utilities by saying, hey, we can manage the charging through the telemetry of our vehicles directly. So they receive the flexibility signals from the utility directly into the OEM's back end, and through the telemetry they manage then the charging times of the cars. So lots of opportunities here. This gives, for instance, customers incentives for lower rates of charging, things like that. And it's really well received also in the bigger trials that are going on. What's going to happen in the US, of course, at this point we don't know. That's I guess a different conversation over a beer. So really, what am I trying to say here, just in summary? So policies are good. We need them. We need to make sure that there's interoperability, that we don't lose assets in the process. But we have to think about, and I don't say that I'm having all the answers here, right? But we have to think about these policies, stay adaptive, right? Agile, if you will, for the programmers amongst you, that we don't really lose assets in the long term. And one thing I noticed in the last few years was also that really the customer integration is important, as far as having honest communications. Things might only pay back down the road, so it might not decrease your energy cost right now, but it may keep it more stable in the future, for instance, things like that. But also what we saw over the last 20-25 years was that the customer needs to be hands off, in a sense. We originally thought it would be great for the customer to be always involved. It's not really that interesting for them, right? It needs to be a set it and forget it approach for customer equipment. They just need to know it works, gives them some benefit down the line, and they also can contribute to basically a greener grid and things like that. Last but not least, of course, you already get my drift here throughout the whole presentation. Having my standards hat on, really using standards instead of proprietary APIs and other things will over time cut the cost extremely, and it will protect both sides really from stranded assets, vendor lock-ins, and things like that. So with that, I'm gonna pass it back to Jordan, and then to lots of these very, very knowledgeable speakers that will follow me here.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that, Rolf. I do have some quick questions for you just before you go. I think we have 5 minutes left. How did US consumers react to the programs established over there when they were first established?
Yeah, really an interesting question, right? It was, if we want to jump through the years, right? So for instance, in 2005, as I mentioned, there was this idea of controlling the customer equipment. But another thought that gained a lot of traction at the time was to give customers these energy sort of devices that would show them what the energy status or the price currently is. So they would get these so-called in-home displays, right? They were even refrigerator magnets to pop there, and you would sometimes see like red, orange, green, like a traffic light. And some customers were initially pretty excited about that, but then it was found that probably more than 90% of these devices ended up in a drawer within a couple of weeks, right? Like I said, it's energy is not really like Instagram or Snapchat, right, or TikTok, right? It's not that captivating, right? So but I think we have seen now that lately customers become much more technology savvy, of course, especially, I wouldn't really call it younger generation. I still feel like I'm young enough, and I was talking about the 80s earlier, right? But people are used to having like integrated devices, right? So for them, it becomes much more common to have this, and to be able to set things up. So I think there is good customer acceptance when you really explain things right. So I think especially utility companies, I think, need to get better marketing and PR firms to help with that.
I think we're definitely seeing this shift from pure consumers to more prosumers, especially here in the UK. I think like one big win on the prosumer side has been like Octopus Energy's flexible tariffs. It's really got people who were never interested in energy beforehand, because you just paid a price, and no matter how much energy you use, that was the price you paid. Or you know what I mean, in terms of like per kilowatt hour. Now you've got agile tariffs where, you know, it
Yeah.
changes based on the time of day, constantly, every single day. There's new prices, and I think that has really spurred people on to sort of be more thoughtful about the energy that they're using, and shifting it to the times where the grid can handle it a bit better. Speaking of that, why do you think there are not more customer inclusive programs in Europe in general?
Yeah, we have been, I mean, the OpenADR Alliance, as I mentioned, was originally incorporated in California, but
Mm,
OpenADR has pretty quickly spread across the US and then Asia, Japan, Korea, even China. They have a, translated version into Chinese, of course, and New Zealand and so on. But I don't know, Europe was just always a bit slower there for some reason. And I think, there are maybe some legacy regulations that may hold things back to some extent. I was recently told, for instance, that there is a small clause somewhere, for instance, in the German energy law that the distribution utility is actually not allowed to influence the customer's consumption, right? So, but this has nothing to do, obviously, with today's flexibility, right? This was from,
yeah,
I don't know, 50 years ago, right? Where the regulator simply thought, the utility shouldn't, they're a service, they're a
yeah,
general service. They shouldn't, influence the customer, right? Of course, nowadays we are talking about completely different scenarios, right? So these kind of things, they may be still ingrained in a lot of areas, right? So the customer is still there, this wild species out there, right? This buying power and paying for it, right? So, but we are seeing now, I think that shift in particular when EV chargers came in, heat pumps, now other systems, right? That you kind of have to do something, otherwise
yeah.
you're left behind.
I think as we see more instances like you mentioned earlier with the Iberian blackout, I think they start to realize that, okay, you can't just rely on the way we've always done things. We've got to learn from what's happening now, especially as we go towards net zero with more intermittent um, generation. So yeah, perfect. Thanks, Rolf. That's all the questions we have, I believe. Yeah, and we're right on time. It's 10:05 or 10:04. So thank you very much for that very interesting session. That very
Thank you
interesting
for having
opinion,
me.
and it was
All right.
great to have you back.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have a good session.